Yep.
Loud and clear. Okay. Look, first thing I have to say is folly that Paddy and Chris's presentations said it all about why we shouldn't be culverting this. But look, I'll try and give a bit of engineering alternatives and why the alternatives are there. If anyone was in any doubt. I'll pose a number of questions, but basically, can flood relief be achieved without causing environmental destruction? I am an engineer. I'm slightly embarrassed to say that to a Blackpool audience. Engineers have been responsible for two types of flows through Blackpool. That's people and water. And they've gifted the N20 motorway dividing the community in Blackpool and culverts, which have caused flooding in Blackpool. So look, I'm a bit sheepish, on behalf of my profession in that regard. But look, I've soldiered with Chris for a while on this, and I've had the benefit of all Chris's correspondence with the powers that be in the OPW, the City Council, and it's become patently clear to me that, the old adage, if you don't understand the problem, how can you solve it? And I'll start with what's not included in the assessment of flooding in Blackpool. And, it might build up a picture of how can you have this understanding. But the impact of the blockages in the culvert network, I've seen firsthand presentations following the flood events in Blackpool and the debris that was taken out of the culvert system. I've seen reports that Chris has sometimes been frustrated in his efforts in obtaining, but he's tenacious, and he's received quite a lot of information on where bank collapses have happened along the Bride, and all that debris swept into the culvert network, and the capacity of that culvert network greatly reduced in the lead up to some of the flood events. And look, because of that inherent disadvantage of culverts, response is often trialed of trash screens. And Chris has pointed to the collapse of these trash screens, and I've seen the photos. The collapse mechanism can only be described as catastrophic, and there's a sudden release of that dammed up water that you've seen in some of Chris's photos. So the impact of those haven't been fully appreciated, or certainly hasn't been published if it is appreciated in any of the documentation in assessing the problem or proposing a solution to the problem. Now, Chris alluded to it there as well, that there was meant to be an attenuation and a flood storage reservoir in the retail park. Now, that was never enforced. It's a planning requirement, and at no cost at all to the state, that enforcement function and capability still exists, and that could be that could be followed up on in the morning if there was a will. Now, that issue wasn't even assessed or contained or referred to in any of the documentation, so we won't know what impact that had. And a lot of these flood, look, Chris said that they've taken away the trash screens, but trash screens are just a symptom of the disease that is culverts. They're a response, and they're an imperfect response, and they cause greater problems. And as sure as eggs are eggs, they've taken away the trash screens now because they were attributed to causing the flooding. And as Chris said, there's 8 years without flooding because they've removed the trash screens, but all that debris and vegetation will wash into the culvert system bit by bit, build up, reduce the capacity, and there'll be a flood event, big investigation, and the solution will be to put trash screens back in. And you saw that with the extensive trash screens that are being proposed now by the OPW on their scheme of the extended culvert network. And look, I don't have a crystal ball, and none of us do, but I'll make a bold prediction here and now that at some point in the future, there'll be a response to take out those trash screens because they've caused flooding, and they'll be taken out, and we'll start the whole process all over again. So the scheme as proposed, again, Chris has been in correspondence with the OPW on the cost estimates. And look, I was between the phrase Keystone Cops and Ragball Rovers when it came to some of these figures. In 2016, there was an OPW estimate that the project would cost 12 million. Now, you'll all have seen that that's risen in the publications of announcements in the last few days. But in 2019, Chris was corresponding with the OPW on this and what's the current estimates. And he was given a list of figures, all ex-VAT, and told they added up to 18 million. And the eagle-eyed amongst you will see that they actually add up to 18.5 million. So that went, and that was ex-VAT. And then the maintenance ex-VAT was added on to that. And they all added up to give 20.5 million, including VAT. So obviously the question went back, you know, where's the VAT? How can this happen? So they followed up in correspondence, and this is all here. This is all the OPW's figures, whether it be their published reports or in correspondence that I've seen and I have hold of myself from Chris. So they've, to include for VAT, they knocked off 500,000 on the fees and supervision costs, and they knocked out the project contingency, you know, which is a very, very foolhardy thing to do, in my opinion. So magically, the figure stayed at 20.5 million a few days afterwards, after Chris drew their attention to these miscalculations, we'll call them. And lo and behold, 2 years later, the scheme has been announced to cost 20.5 million. So look, simple economics in the reports. Originally, the present value benefit of the scheme is 18.65 million. Now, that's a figure that's contained in the report. It's not my figure, it's not my calculation. But the latest cost estimate as of 2019 and right through to today exceeds that figure. So the cost exceeds the benefit. Now, if I'm a project manager on that, I have a problem. You know, it just, you don't need Chris, Paddy, myself, Dominic, or anyone else to take a judicial review. The bean counters in the Department of Finance will get hold of this, and they'll draw a line through the project and say, it ain't happening. It's an unjustifiable use of rare and even getting rarer public funds. So it's a non-runner. And you might have heard of an issue around the Children's Hospital in Dublin. Scrutiny and financial scrutiny of public projects has increased because of that, and the world has changed. There's spending codes that have come out since this project was conceived, and even since they corresponded with Chris on the 20.5 million. So there's a bit of an issue there. You don't even need the Comptroller and Auditor General to draw a line through this. The government are announcing new independent task force and teams to carry out this scrutiny on public jobs. So if I'm a resident business owner in Blackpool that wants flood relief, I'm scratching my head and going, why wasn't I told this? And is there an alternative? And, you know, the question is there, does there have to be another alternative before this is either challenged in court successfully, or an accountant gets hold of it, or a financial controller, or an independent body, or the Comptroller or the Auditor General? So the good news for Blackpool is there is another alternative, and I haven't come up with it. The OPW have come up with it, and these are their words: due to the significant storage potential at Ballincrokig and its potential to reduce the peak flow of the design event by circa 10 cubic meters per second, this option is deemed technically viable. So it's technically viable, and it might surprise people or might not surprise people, but this was actually a cheaper alternative back in 2016. and we'll get to the reasons of why it wasn't chosen if it was cheaper and technically viable in a moment. But to put that 10 cubic meters in perspective, you'll see on the left of your screen the flow at Orchard Court during a flood event, during the design flood event, is forecasted to be 34.44 cubic meters per second. So almost a third of the flow can be attenuated upstream. That's for every 3 liters going through Blackpool in a storm, in a flood event, the design flood event, you could take out one of those 3 liters. That would have a massive impact. And look, it's in the OPW's documentation, and it's not buried. It's there for all to see that that is a viable alternative and it would work. There were other upstream storage areas identified, and in this ongoing quest for the silver bullet solution, they were deemed individually, both on the Glen Stream and other branches of the Bride, they were deemed not to be viable on their own. And I'm going to paraphrase the report now, but if you were to use a number of them in combination, look, it was put out there that it would be too hard, you know. Now 20 million would get you over a lot of difficulty in life, you know, and managing a couple of upstream storage reservoirs in combination would be one of those difficulties that I would happily manage for 20.5 million. So if the cheapest technically feasible option wasn't chosen, the obvious question is why? And this is the reason for this is contained in the conclusion of the options assessment report from 2016. And it pointed to the cost benefit analysis and the multi-criteria analysis that there wasn't much between the different options. So when the culvert option was 12 million, almost 10 million less than what it is now, it wasn't that much more expensive than the upstream catchment management. Now, there wasn't much between them, so therefore a decision on the preferred option, and I've added the bold and the underline for emphasis here myself, I must point out. The preferred option was ultimately made by careful and holistic professional consideration of all the various issues, resulting in option 4, which was the culverting of the river through Blackpool, being chosen. Now, holistic professional consideration of all the various issues simply did not happen in 2016 because the findings of the EIAR, which was formerly known as the EIS, people might be more familiar with that, wasn't known when that holistic professional consideration happened. So all the various issues weren't considered. And chief amongst those, as Paddy and Chris pointed out, the permanent significant negative impact on otters and otter habitat, as well as all the other biodiverse benefits of that river, were not considered. They couldn't have been because the findings weren't out there. The professional consideration by an ecologist and the professionals required to reach those judgments. So look, in a nutshell, if culverts are the problem, can culverts be the solution? In my humble opinion, I would say no. You're only storing up problems for the future. I think it's unfair on the people of Blackpool to lead them to believe that this is the solution when the twin weaknesses of the proposals, both in terms of being challenged on environmental grounds, whether it be at judicial review in the High Court or further afield in Europe, and the non-viability of the project on economic grounds. If they're promoting the scheme and they're not being upfront with people, that's one thing. But you know, if it's plain as day that the culverts have caused you difficulty in the past, you know, don't don't listen to all the technical speak, you know, don't disbelieve your own intuition, you know, that culverts can't be the solution. And as a parallel, and bringing it back to the N20, dividing the community in Blackpool, if an engineer, a highly qualified engineer with all the buzzwords, all the jargon came along to you and said, the way I'm going to make it easier for you to cross this road is to widen the road, would you believe them? And look, I'll just leave you with that thought.